7 years ago, it was announced that the Marvel Universe would be rebooting Spider-Man yet again. The character we've already seen in 2.5 trilogies already was finally making his debut in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The original plans for Garfield's Spider-Man seem to have pointed to him being a part of the MCU. But after many contributing factors involving a hacking scandal, low performance, and negative backlash due to the events of the movie, there were officially no more hopes for a third movie. And that's when the time came for Holland's reign to begin. Once Disney settled their deal, on June 23, 2015, it was announced that out of a sea of brunette white boys, Tom Holland was the one chosen to put on the mask once more. He would make his first appearance in Civil War. And not long after, casting for his first solo movie would begin. One of the first additions to the cast was Zendaya, who at the time had only been known for her Disney Channel shows and was just beginning to get recognition for her fashion. Whether it was simply an error that many reporters failed to correct at the time, or always the original intention, in August 2016, it was announced that Zendaya would be playing Mary Jane, and incel-ridden chaos began to ensue. Despite being biracial, Hollywood's typical option that's deemed safe when it comes to attempting to represent just enough people of color to fill the diversity quota they never genuinely care about. She was racially harassed by white supremacist comic book readers who would later include her in their protests against what they called gendercide. Though after months of speculation, Zendaya finally spoke up about the casting and shut it down. Here's what she had to say when asked about the controversy surrounding her being cast. "People are going to react over anything. But nothing is fact. It's like, you guys are just making shit up at this point and then reacting to it. Whenever we were on set, one of us gets some random character name on the call sheet. Bloggers were like, oh, they must be so and so. And we just crack up about it, because it's like, whatever you want to think. You'll find out. It's funny to watch the guessing game. But of course there's going to be outrage over that because for some reason some people just aren't ready. I'm like, I don't know what America you live in, but from what I see when I walk outside my streets of New York right now, I see lots of diversity and I see the real world and it's beautiful, and that's what should be reflected and that's what is reflected, so you're just going to have to get over it." The rest of the supporting cast was established not long after and more controversy was met, 99% of it having to do with the alleged race-bending of many of the characters we've previously seen. Or some of the most noticeable changes, such as Aunt May being cast as a woman in her 50s instead of her 70s. The reboot was shaping up to be one of the most different live-action Spider-Man adaptations yet, and that was exactly what John Watts, the director whose name you'll be hearing a lot of, was desperately trying to achieve. It's an understandable goal. There's this thing called oversaturation, and once you've seen something rebooted more than 3 times, it's not surprising that you would want to see something new. Yet even less surprising, the one thing that none of the directors of these reboots decided to change was Spider-Man being yet another brunette white boy. For them, it was okay to make changes that were slight to borderline drastic when it came to certain plot points or especially supporting characters. But Spider-Man's whiteness? That was something always here to stay. So beyond the supporting cast, what exactly was going to make White Spider-Man number 3 any different than his white successors? Well, for one big thing, he was going to officially be a part of the Marvel Universe. That was already established. Though this early on to the story, it's actually quite easier to explain what wasn't going to be a part of this iteration. It started with Uncle Ben. Because seeing another white Spider-Man was a-okay, but hearing Uncle Ben talk about responsibility for the 3rd time would be overkill. Too soon? There were no references to the Daily Bugle, another intentional decision from the makers of the film. Then of course there was the main characterification of the never-ending presence of MCU characters who overstayed their welcome. That was always going to be a given since they all existed in the same universe now, but the decision to begin a Spider-Man story like this never seemed like the wise one to make, even if it would get a couple $2 billion in the end. So back to the supporting characters, one of the most controversial changes to the adaptation to this day. The writers worked long and hard to keep Zendaya's character's true identity a secret. They managed to do so, because Marvel execs would come to your house with blindfolds and pitchforks in the middle of the night if otherwise, until the movie's official premiere, and soon we would all figure out why her face was so heavily promoted off-screen. You have to keep in mind that at the time, she was the most famous young cast member in the movie. She didn't only have a massive Disney fandom as one of the last Disney stars of her era to see widespread relevance, and yes, they used Disney Channel to promote the movie several times. But she also had nearly 50 million Instagram followers in 2017. Her public reach, especially with social media hardly at its peak, was undeniable. And the studio used that with all of their efforts. There wasn't a single poster they left her out of. They practically promoted her like she was the romantic lead. Which most people who knew the rumors that sparked with her role knew she would be, but the trailers didn't go out of their way to give us any indication of that being true. And she was in every one, so naturally, many people thought she'd end up just as important as Ned was looking to be. Because he was Peter's best friend in the movie. It would only make sense if his love interest was given the same if not more attention. Right? The press tour came to an end and we were finally given the chance to see the movie for ourselves. Millions of people would be seeing a brand new Spider-Man once again. And if you were a part of the population that grew up on Disney, you were about to witness your first time being Zendaya baited. If it isn't obvious, I saw the movie more as a protest against the neckbeards who were sending her hate over not having red hair. So you should have seen the look on my face as I watched the movie for the first time, waiting for her character to show up at any moment, waiting for her to be as important as MJ is supposed to be in everything related to Spider-Man, and then later finding out that she had only gotten a little over 2 minutes of screen time total in the movie. This would go on to happen 4 more times. Yet this time, the reason her role was kept so much of a secret, the reason why the writers shied away from discussing her role despite using her as much as they could, was because they wanted to throw people off and make her name reveal this big, unexpected moment to shock viewers everywhere, all while giving her nothing of actual importance in the movie, beyond 2 minutes of one-liners that would end up swept under the rug with all of the action and events of the movie. We've seen this happen before, and they did not succeed the first time. So what exactly made them think they would in this movie? From a business standpoint, it's understandable why they cast Zendaya as MJ. She was favorably famous yet only had Disney Channel credits to her name. They knew she was capable of bringing in viewers from that alone. She passed the chemistry tests with Holland, which had to mean she was promised something bigger. That had to be the explanation. The way they were marketing her told me they knew she was going to be carrying a lot of the promo on her back. But what they didn't know of was the star that she was slowly becoming. They didn't know that when they cast a Disney kid as the loner in the background who could either make the audience laugh or want to hurl slurs at her, that she would eventually become the Emmy-winning actress she is today and be a part of one of the few very flawed but undeniable cultural resets that is Euphoria, which I will definitely be making a video on later. They knew her presence was big in real life, but purposely tried to keep her on-screen presence small. I can tell you this now, it had to be one of the biggest bags they decided to fumble right from the moment they chickened out from calling her Mary Jane. Their shock and intentional controversy did pay off though. Tickets were sold. But Zendaya's interpretation of MJ was given disproportionately negative feedback. In her 2 minutes of screen time, she not only called herself the name that was deemed sacred and untouchable.
My friends call me MJ.
But she also did something that will never sit right with the incel community if they ever had a say in it. She had the smugness they praise in their favorite grown adult male characters. But then she mentioned protesting and slavery.
I was hoping to get in some light protesting in front of one of the embassies before dinner.
I don't really want to celebrate something that was built by slaves.
Oh, I'm sure the Washington Monument wasn't built by... Okay.
Both instances were played for laughs by the entirely white, entirely male team of writers. But she said the lines right in the middle of the era in which fanboys began to complain about the MCU, which in 2017 had still yet to have a movie with a lead that wasn't white or wasn't a man, going quote-unquote woke was the red flag they needed to begin their 5-year-long attack. There are many reasons to criticize the character that is MJ. But it doesn't help that no matter what section of discourse you decide to dive into, you're more than likely going to find references to her race mentioned. This is the thing that led to the reception of most of the side characters being neutral, and I say that very generously, to negative at best. Though for the character that was promised to have an even more important role outside of being a side character, You would think that the writers would spend more time actually developing her. Her name alone indicated that she would be the next love interest, so why did she have little to no interactions with Peter at all? Why was most of her time on screen spent with one-liners that could only land so well in an audience filled with white male nerds who look exactly like the white male nerd writers behind this movie? It's not like the writers weren't asking these questions themselves. They were at least that self-aware in that end. Otherwise, they wouldn't have filmed a scene that was later scrapped that seemed to feature a bit of insight on MJ's home life. It appeared to be after the decathlon and she was alone, possibly meaning her parents abandoned her and she couldn't get a ride home. Now that would have been small, but in the long run it definitely would have been more important and meant more for her story than seeing her eat toast in poorly tailored clothes. You can tell the writers even realized this mistake when they included a practically identical moment in Far From Home. And no matter how small it was, we managed to learn more about his home life in 5 seconds than we learned about MJ's in 5 years. One thing that every writer is taught by day one is the importance of showing and not telling. Even if now we have a canon/fun-known last name from Michelle and a brief mention of her having a dad.
Oh no, we cannot go to my house, my dad will kill you! What?
Nothing will ever land as well as showing what her life looked like outside of being Peter's loner classmate or potential love interest. To this day, it will never make sense why we knew more about the love interest that was put on a bus's life than we knew about the love interest that was supposed to be here to stay's life. Even with Ned, Peter's best friend for who knows how long, because unlike the other movies, we aren't told exactly when they became friends. That's what this franchise had a habit of doing, throwing you into something without much of an explanation and then hoping you can keep up with it. We don't see Ned's house until the last movie he's presumed to be in. He also has 0 traits from his original comic counterpart, so the writers could make more room for him to take traits from Gank, Miles Morales' best friend. Instead, the writers took so much from Gank for Ned to the point where when making the modern-day classic that is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Gank's screen time was cut tremendously due to the ITSV writers being afraid that they would get plagiarism allegations for showing too much of his character despite them being the ones to originate him. In their search for reinvention and originality, they did more stealing than creating on their own. They prided themselves in putting people of color in roles that we haven't seen them in terms of Spider-Man stories, yet couldn't even fully commit to giving any of the characters their own personalities or depth except the one they deemed the most important one, who also happened to be the only white one. This is one of the many reasons why the decision to attempt to make this iteration of Spider-Man look diverse on the surface ended up resulting in nothing but cowardice in the end. You can't pride yourselves on diversity if you aren't going to treat your characters of color like human beings. You can't throw actors of color into the spotlight, promoting your movies on their backs, while giving them the absolute bare minimum to work with on screen. You think you're doing something revolutionary as a white man by supposedly creating a story that's never been done before, when in reality people of color have been playing second fiddle to white leads since the beginning of film. You want a definition for throwing characters of color into movies without giving them any importance or depth outside of their white counterparts? Tokenism. It's the term that's existed for over 6 decades. You've had 6 decades to understand how this is wrong, and attempted diversity in a story that you still demand to be led by a white man still falls under this disgusting narrative. What exactly would I do to fix all of this myself? Well, the first mistake was not properly establishing Peter and MJ's supposed grand relationship from the beginning and making MJ a fully fleshed out character on her own beforehand. There was also no need for the shocking personality change, which I wouldn't have had a problem with if we were at least shown depth and got to know her actual interests beyond being as much comic relief as Ned was made out to be. I would have also fully commit to her being Mary Jane. The casting directors chose an actress who literally has a white mother. She could have simply put in some hair dye and sure they would have seethed even more, but seeing her as a comic accurate MJ would have been more bold and gasp-worthy than seeing her as the Gen Z version of Allison Reynolds pre-makeover. And don't even get me started on Ned. While he had always been a likable character, just as likable as Gank, he was the first of Peter's on-screen best friends to have no backstory on his own, just as MJ was the first love interest to have no backstory of her own. Watching the previous Spider-Man movies, while many argue that certain characters aren't portrayed as completely accurate or perfect, at least they had scenes and a story outside of Peter. They were given agency and we were able to see their lives and what impacted their motivations outside of Peter's point of view. You know what would have been more revolutionary than giving your characters of color minimal screen time, with most of it being made to serve the white lead? Giving them fleshed out storylines of their own. We waited 5 years to see what the inside of Ned's home looked like. It took the former Spider-Man movies only 1 year to do that with their supporting characters, and that was the year the movies came out. We waited 5 years for MJ to get a last name, and in this incredibly non-concerning context, it's revealed last minute inside of a police station to be Jones. Fasten your seatbelts, Watson.
Miss Jones Watson?
Jones, I don't go by Watson.
While that feels assuring to hear, knowing that the hashtag #NotMyMJ protesters and the gendercide truthers went into a period of mourning, knowing what happens at the end of the movie, and knowing that even up to this point we still have no idea what Michelle's home life is actually like beyond her not wanting to identify with the last name Watson for reasons unexplained. The decision feels cowardly and as if the writers already knew she and Ned were being presumably written off so the backlash wouldn't be too much of a big deal. Calling her Watson was the biggest connection she had to the comic book version of MJ. Then by the end of the movie, every version of her we saw on screen was retconned, and we would more than likely never be seeing her again. Not only are a large amount of white supremacists proud of the memory wipe decision at the end, but because of this, the next leads are most likely going to be just as white as Spider-Man has been in live-action adaptations for nearly 2 decades now. People who hated MCU Spider-Man said that the last 15 minutes of the movie were the best minutes of the entire franchise. From the Spider-Man perspective of things, seeing him actually create his suit from scratch and live life on his own was refreshing to see. And I shouldn't have expected much. But the fact that the only way to satisfy a fandom rife with racism was to get rid of the characters of color that you used to pride yourself on promoting just feels like something a disingenuous coward would do. The thing is, incel nerds tend to have an obsession with calling things woke or forced or political. They would see literally one black person on screen and deem the entire project a product of wokeness and then go on to boycott it. They would say that something is focusing too much on politics if a character happens to be non-white and shockingly the lead of the story. In this case, a white director made the deliberate decision to cast nearly every supporting role as non-white. Then when he saw that it didn't work out for him and resulted in more backlash than praise, instead of standing in it and going the extra mile to give these characters depth, when the racism got too loud he didn't decide to fight back even harder. No. He did exactly what every other white person in Hollywood does when they want to be applauded for something trendy only to hop off of it when everyone's moved on to something else. He put them on a bus, and what he once praised as a story celebrating diversity showed us what it was from the very beginning. Another white Spider-Man movie.